Have you ever noticed how anger feels like a fire inside your chest? It flares up suddenly, hot, fierce, and blinding. At first, it seems like a force outside of us, something that happens because of someone else's actions. But the truth is, this fire doesn't just burn the people around us. It scorches the very heart that carries it. Anger is an invisible blaze, quietly consuming our peace, our clarity, and sometimes even our very sense of self. Imagine for a moment you're walking down a familiar path when suddenly someone cuts in front of you without warning, maybe even pushing past with no apology. That prick of irritation flares instantly. Your breath shortens. Your mind races. And before you know it, anger is knocking loudly at your door. But what if I told you that this response, this fire you feel, is something we can learn to understand, and maybe even tame? Anger, as natural as it seems, is actually a double-edged sword. On one side, it alerts us to injustice or harm, signaling that something in our world feels off. It's a protective instinct. But on the other side, unchecked, anger becomes a prison of its own making. It traps us in cycles of resentment, frustration, and suffering that extend far beyond the initial cause. In Buddhist teachings, anger is seen not just as a fleeting emotion but as one of the three poisons, alongside greed and ignorance, that cloud our minds and bind us to suffering. This is no small matter. Anger is not merely an inconvenience. It's a root cause of much of the pain we experience internally and in our relationships. What's striking is how anger blinds us to this reality. When caught in its grip, we feel justified, righteous even. We tell ourselves stories that fuel the fire. They did this to me on purpose. I deserve better. How dare they hurt me? These thoughts fan the flames higher, leaving us restless, agitated, and disconnected. But what if anger is really a sign of something deeper within us, something hidden under the surface? Could it be masking pain, fear, or unmet needs? Could it be that beneath the roaring fire lies a fragile heart desperate for understanding, healing, and peace? This invisible fire, then, is both a warning and an invitation. A warning that we're carrying burdens too heavy for our well-being, and an invitation to look inward with courage. Instead of reacting with fury, we might learn to pause, breathe, and ask, what is this anger trying to tell me? What do I really need right now? Learning to recognize anger's true nature is the first step on a journey, not just to control anger, but to transform it. It is a journey of self-awareness and compassion, where we discover that beneath the rage is a chance to reclaim our freedom. Because holding on to anger is like holding on to burning coal. We suffer most by refusing to let go. This journey is not about denying our feelings or pretending we're always calm. It's about facing the fire honestly without being consumed by it. It's about understanding that anger, while powerful, is not the master of our fate. We can be. So, as we begin, consider this. The fire inside is not your enemy. It's a messenger. And by listening carefully, you can learn not only to survive its heat, but to use it as fuel for anger. Is a powerful force, but where does it really come from? To truly understand how to let go of anger, we need to trace it back to its roots. Because anger doesn't arise from thin air. It grows out of something deeper inside us, something often hidden beneath the surface. In the teachings of the Buddha, anger is not seen as just an isolated feeling or momentary reaction. It is one of the three poisons, alongside greed and ignorance, that cloud our mind and keep us trapped in suffering. But what exactly makes anger so poisonous? Why does it take hold so easily, and why is it so hard to let go? At its core, anger arises from a fundamental misunderstanding of reality. It comes from what Buddhists call avidya, or ignorance. Not just ignorance of facts, but a deep confusion about who we are and how the world works. We tend to believe in a solid, unchanging self, a personal identity that must be defended and protected at all costs. When someone hurts us or crosses a boundary, it feels like a threat to this self. That triggers anger, a fierce instinct to push back, protect, and fight. But here's the catch. This sense of a fixed self is actually an illusion. It's a mental construct, a story our minds tell us to make sense of experience. In truth, everything is constantly changing, fluid, interconnected. The self we cling to is more like a wave on the ocean than a solid rock. Because we don't see this clearly, we react as if our sense of self is fragile and under siege. We want things to be a certain way, to follow our expectations and desires. When reality doesn't match those expectations, when someone hurts us, disrespects us, or denies us, we feel wounded and anger rises up as a natural defense. But this defense comes with a heavy cost. Anger fuels more anger. It blinds us to the bigger picture and keeps us trapped in cycles of blame and suffering. It creates tension in our bodies, disrupts our relationships, and clouds our ability to respond with wisdom. Another root of anger is attachment. We become attached to how we think things should be, how others should treat us, how life should unfold. When reality violates these attachments, anger is the emotional eruption that follows. Imagine holding a precious object tightly in your hands, afraid of losing it. The tighter you grasp, the more pain you feel if it slips away. That's how attachment works inside the mind. And anger is often the desperate cry of this attachment when it feels threatened. Yet beneath the anger and attachment lies pain. Sometimes, anger masks hurt, fear, or vulnerability. It's easier to feel anger than to face the raw wounds underneath. This protective mask keeps us from acknowledging our deeper feelings, feelings that, if ignored, can grow into bitterness or resentment. Understanding these roots is essential because it shifts how we relate to anger. Instead of seeing anger as something shameful or something to be suppressed, we can start to see it as a signal, a message from our mind that something needs attention, healing, or change. From this perspective, anger becomes a doorway that invites us to look more deeply at ourselves, to question the stories we tell, to loosen our grip on fixed identities and attachments, and to embrace a more fluid, compassionate way of being. In Buddhist practice, this understanding is the beginning of true freedom from anger. It's like tracing a tangled vine back to its root before carefully untwisting it. Only by seeing where anger truly arises can we begin to gently unwind the knots and release the grip it has on our lives. And as we do, something remarkable happens. The fire inside begins to cool. The fierce heat of anger gives way to a quiet clarity, a softening of the heart. Not because the outer world has changed, but because our relationship to that world has transformed. This is not about denying justice or ignoring harm. It's about responding from a place of wisdom, strength, and calm. A place where anger no longer rules, but rather informs us, guiding us toward healthier choices. As we move forward, we'll explore how the illusions we hold about self, others, and the world fuel anger. We'll see how shifting our perspective can dissolve these illusions, freeing us from anger's grip. And we'll discover practical tools from mindfulness and meditation that help us observe anger with kindness, without being swept away. Because the truth is, the root of anger is not some outside enemy waiting to attack. It's a shadow cast by misunderstanding inside ourselves. And by shining the light of awareness and compassion there, pain, hurt, and anger, they often come as a tangled bundle, each feeding the other, making it hard to know where one ends and another begins. But what if the hurt we feel, the sting that triggers anger, is itself born from illusions we carry deep within our minds? At the heart of many Buddhist teachings is the radical idea that much of our suffering arises from misunderstanding the true nature of reality. We cling to stories, labels, and fixed ideas that don't hold up under close inspection. These illusions create the fertile ground where hurt takes root and grows. Think about how easy it is to feel wounded by another's words or actions. You might hear a harsh comment or sense rejection, and instantly a wave of pain crashes over you. But what if this pain is not just about what happened outside, but about how you perceive it inside? Our minds have a way of weaving narratives, a mental movie where we cast ourselves as the victim and others as the offender. This story, compelling as it feels, is often a distortion. It's a selective interpretation, shaped by our fears, past wounds, and unmet expectations. One key illusion is the belief in separateness. We see ourselves as isolated islands, separate from others and the world. When someone hurts us, it feels personal and absolute, as if a boundary has been violently breached. Yet, in truth, we are deeply interconnected. Our actions, emotions, and experiences ripple outwards, affecting and being affected by countless others. When we grasp this interconnectedness, the sharp edges of hurt begin to soften. We start to see the bigger picture, a world where actions arise from countless causes and conditions, many beyond any one person's control. Another illusion lies in permanence. We expect people, situations, and even ourselves to stay the same, to act according to how we want or remember them. When change happens or expectations are broken, pain arises. But change is the only constant. Holding tightly to what was or what should be only deepens our suffering. Behind hurt often lies attachment, to identity, to how things should unfold, to approval, or to safety. When these attachments are challenged, hurt is the emotional alarm that sounds. But here's a powerful insight. Hurt is not just a passive feeling, it's also a choice, shaped by how we respond to the moment. We can cling to the story of being wronged, or we can begin to question it, opening space for understanding and even forgiveness. This doesn't mean ignoring real harm or pretending everything is fine. It means seeing clearly how our own minds contribute to the pain. It means shining a light on the illusions that keep us trapped in cycles of hurt and anger. Buddhist practice offers tools for this: mindfulness, loving kindness, and wisdom. By learning to observe our feelings without immediately reacting, by recognizing the stories we tell ourselves, we create room for transformation. Imagine standing by a clear lake. When the water is still, you see right to the bottom. But when stirred, the water becomes murky and dark. Our minds are like that lake. Anger and hurt stir the waters, clouding our vision. But with calm and patience, the surface settles, revealing the truth beneath. In this clarity, hurt loses its power to control us. We can respond with compassion, not only for others but for ourselves, acknowledging our wounds without letting them define us. So, as we continue this journey, remember, the hurt that feeds anger often grows from illusions we carry, illusions of separateness, permanence, and attachment. Seeing through these illusions is like lifting a veil, allowing us to meet reality with open eyes and an open heart. And when that happens, the fire of anger begins. Forgiveness. It's a word that carries weight, a promise of peace, yet often feels elusive or even impossible when we're deeply hurt. But what if forgiveness is not just a gift we give to others, but the key that unlocks our own freedom from anger? When we hold on to anger, it's like clutching a hot coal, hoping the other person will burn. But in reality, it's our own hands that get scorched. Forgiveness is the act of releasing that coal, not for someone else's sake, but to heal ourselves. In Buddhism, forgiveness is deeply tied to compassion and wisdom. It's not about condoning wrongdoing or forgetting harm. Instead, it's a deliberate choice to let go of resentment, freeing ourselves from the chains that bind our hearts. Why is forgiveness so powerful? Because anger and resentment act like shackles, imprisoning our minds in cycles of pain. They keep us hooked to the past, reliving wounds over and over. Forgiveness breaks these chains, opening the door to healing. But forgiveness doesn't happen overnight. It's a practice, a journey, and it begins with understanding the humanity in ourselves and others. Everyone carries suffering, everyone makes mistakes, everyone acts from causes we may not fully see. When we start to see the world through this lens, forgiveness becomes less about justice or punishment and more about recognizing shared vulnerability. Imagine carrying a heavy backpack filled with stones, each stone a grievance, a hurt, a moment of anger. Forgiveness is setting down that backpack, feeling the relief as your shoulders lighten. It doesn't erase the past, but it changes how you carry it. Practically, Forgiveness can start with small steps. It might mean simply acknowledging the pain without feeding it. It could be silently wishing well to the person who caused hurt, or speaking honestly about feelings without blame. Mindfulness and meditation are powerful tools here. They help us observe anger and resentment as passing clouds, not permanent storms. They train the mind to respond with calm instead of reaction. One Buddhist practice called metta, or loving-kindness meditation, cultivates goodwill toward ourselves and others, even those who have caused harm. Through metta, we nurture a heart that is open and resilient, capable of forgiveness. And as forgiveness grows, we discover something beautiful: freedom. Freedom not because the world has changed, but because our relationship to it has. We stop being prisoners of anger and start becoming architects of peace. Forgiveness transforms pain into wisdom, bitterness into compassion, isolation into connection. Yet, forgiveness is not about forcing feelings or rushing healing. It's about patience and self-compassion, knowing that the journey is as important as the destination. So, if you're holding on to anger right now, know this: forgiveness is within reach. It's a practice available to all, a path that leads back to yourself, whole, free, and at peace. And from this place of forgiveness, the fire of anger no longer has power over you. Instead, it becomes a quiet ember, reminding you of your strength and your capacity to heal. In the midst of pain and anger, there is often a restless storm inside us, a whirlwind of emotions, thoughts, and reactions that pulls us deeper into suffering. But what if there was a way to step back, to become an observer rather than a victim of this storm? This is where mindfulness and meditation come in, powerful tools that allow us to see clearly and transform our inner experience. Mindfulness means paying attention moment by moment, without judgment. It's about being fully present with whatever arises in the mind and body, whether it's discomfort, joy, anger, or peace. Through mindfulness, we begin to notice the subtle patterns behind our emotions, the triggers, the fleeting thoughts, and the sensations that ripple through us. Meditation, then, is the dedicated practice of cultivating this mindful awareness. It's like training a muscle. With consistent effort, we strengthen our ability to stay calm and centered, even when emotions run high. Why does this matter when it comes to anger? Because anger is often a reaction that happens before we have a chance to pause and understand. It can be automatic, fueled by old habits and conditioned responses. But mindfulness creates a space, a gap between stimulus and reaction, where choice becomes possible. Imagine a moment when someone says something hurtful. Without mindfulness, anger may flare instantly, flooding the mind with painful thoughts and intensifying the hurt. With mindfulness, we notice the anger rising like a wave, observe it without judgment, and choose how to respond rather than being swept away. This practice doesn't mean suppressing or denying anger. Instead, it teaches us to hold anger gently, like a fragile bird, observing its shape and sound without crushing it or letting it fly wild. Over time, meditation reveals deeper layers beneath anger, often fear, insecurity, or unmet needs. When we acknowledge these hidden feelings with kindness, the fire of anger begins to soften. Scientific studies also confirm what ancient Buddhist teachers have known for centuries. Regular mindfulness meditation changes the brain. It increases areas linked to emotional regulation, empathy, and compassion. It calms the nervous system, reducing stress and improving resilience. One simple mindfulness exercise is to focus on the breath, noticing its natural rhythm, feeling the air enter and leave the body. When the mind wanders, gently guiding it back to the breath, without frustration or judgment. This practice anchors us in the present moment, helping to break free from repetitive cycles of rumination and anger. Another meditation technique is noting, where we label each experience, anger, sadness, joy, as it arises, recognizing its impermanence. Anger, passing. This gentle acknowledgement lessens the grip of strong emotions. Mindfulness also extends beyond formal meditation. It can be woven into daily life, during a walk, a meal, or a conversation, transforming ordinary moments into opportunities for presence and insight. Through mindfulness and meditation, we reclaim our power. Instead of being controlled by anger, we become its master. We learn to respond with wisdom and compassion, both toward ourselves and others. This transformation is profound because it shifts the story we tell ourselves. We no longer see anger as a burden to carry, but as a signal, a message that something within needs attention and care. And with this shift, the impossible starts to become possible. The ability to face hurt without being consumed by anger. Anger often feels like a wall, a barrier that separates us from others, from understanding, and sometimes even from ourselves. But what if behind this wall lies a doorway? A doorway to compassion, the powerful antidote that can dissolve anger and heal the wounds beneath it. Compassion, at its core, is the ability to recognize suffering in others and in ourselves, and respond with kindness, patience, and an open heart. It's not about ignoring harm or weakness, but about meeting pain with empathy rather than judgment. Buddhism teaches that compassion arises naturally when we see the interconnectedness of all beings. We come to understand that everyone struggles, everyone makes mistakes, and everyone longs for happiness and freedom from suffering. When anger flares, it often masks deeper feelings: fear, hurt, disappointment. Compassion invites us to look beneath the surface and meet these feelings gently, like tending to a fragile flower. Imagine a moment when someone's actions cause you pain. Instead of immediately reacting with anger, compassion encourages you to pause and ask, what might they be going through? What suffering might be driving their behavior? This shift in perspective doesn't excuse harmful actions, but offers a more expansive view, one that recognizes complexity, imperfection, and shared humanity. Practicing compassion towards others naturally extends inward, nurturing self-compassion. Often, we are our own harshest critics, fueling cycles of guilt and resentment. But self-compassion softens these inner voices, allowing healing and growth. One practical way to cultivate compassion is through loving-kindness meditation, or metta. This practice involves silently repeating phrases like, "May I be happy," "May I be free from suffering," then extending these wishes to others, loved ones, neutral people, and even those we struggle with. Metta breaks down barriers, opening the heart to a vast reservoir of goodwill. It retrains the mind to replace anger with warmth, judgment with understanding. Scientific research supports this. Compassion meditation strengthens neural pathways linked to empathy and emotional regulation. It also reduces stress and promotes well-being. But compassion is more than meditation, it's a way of being. It shows up in everyday moments: a kind word, a listening ear, a gentle act of forgiveness. As compassion deepens, anger loses its grip. We start to see that holding onto anger only prolongs suffering, both ours and others. Compassion calls us to release resentment and embrace peace. This is not always easy. It requires courage to face pain honestly and vulnerability to open the heart wide. But the rewards are profound: freedom from the chains of anger, deeper connections, and a life lived with greater wisdom and love. So as you walk this path, remember, anger and compassion are not enemies but two sides of the same coin. When one arises, the other can too. And with mindful effort, compassion can shine like a healing light, transforming even. The journey from anger to peace is not a quick fix, but a lifelong path, one deeply rooted in the timeless wisdom of the Buddha's teachings. The Noble Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths offer us a map, guiding us gently from suffering toward lasting freedom. At the heart of these teachings is understanding, seeing clearly the nature of suffering, its causes, and the way to its end. Anger, as we have explored, is a form of suffering born from attachment, ignorance, and misunderstanding. The Four Noble Truths remind us that suffering exists, that it arises from craving and aversion, but most importantly, that it can be overcome. This overcoming comes through the Noble Eightfold Path, a balanced way of living that cultivates wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline. Right view and right intention invite us to understand the roots of anger and set our hearts toward kindness and compassion. Right speech, right action, and right livelihood guide us to act in ways that reduce harm and foster harmony. And right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration strengthen our ability to maintain peace within. By weaving these principles into daily life, we not only transform our anger, but awaken a deeper sense of peace and joy. The fire of anger no longer controls us. Instead, it becomes a teacher, guiding us to greater awareness and love. Remember, this path is not about perfection but progress, each moment a chance to practice forgiveness, mindfulness, and compassion anew. As you reflect on this journey, consider how these ancient teachings can illuminate your own life. How might embracing the Noble Eightfold Path help you release anger and cultivate peace? How can the Four Noble Truths deepen your understanding of suffering and healing? If this exploration resonated with you, I invite you to join our community here. Share your thoughts, your experiences with anger and forgiveness, or questions about Buddhist practice in the comments below. Your story may be the light someone else needs. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next deep dive into Buddhist wisdom and practical life guidance. Together, let's walk this path toward freedom, a path where anger no longer burns us, but compassion and wisdom light the way. Thank